Did you send the link of the class for today?
So link all the time. So no, I didn't send it.
Yeah, it was just to, you always send it one day before or the same day, but I remember that you said it was the same link, so I was looking on the message before, the last message to get into it.
My other classes do fine without me sending it all the time, so I kind of forget that you guys have issues if I don't send it, because the others are fine.
I mean, I know that. I mean, I remember when you said that it's the same link, so I just went to that link of the last week and I did it. But maybe I was just surprised because it's like I don't see the big quantity of my classmates here, so that's what I thought that maybe that was the issue.
No, the ones that aren't here yet are the ones that don't usually come. So that's probably the case at this point. Everyone else has made it on. The regulars have made it on anyways. And we're no later than when we usually start. We usually don't get started until the 35. Now, as for last week, you guys took your quiz. That's going to be your last quiz for a while. So good job, those of you that took that. This week, instead, you have a discussion post that you need to do. It is a short essay. The instructions for that are under the discussion board on Canvas, as well as under modules and under assignments. So whichever place you usually go to find your classwork, it is there. It closes on Sunday, the same as everything else usually does. So you shouldn't have issues with that. And then after that, your next big assignment is your individual presentations. Make sure not to procrastinate on that, or else it's going to come up on you very quickly. And of course, I'm not going to say that, never mind. I'm going to bite my tongue tonight, I think, and just let you guys be. So keep in mind there's not that many assignments left in this class. So those of you that have lower averages, you're running out of time to fix that. Do not miss any more assignments, especially those of you that are in the 70s and 60s ranges with your grades. Do not miss anything else. You won't be able to recover. Keep coming to class so that you can get the materials. Today's class is going to be going over the discussion board material question. The discussion board has you compare and contrast things. My morning classes, when they were asked to compare and contrast something, had a bit of an issue with it. Comparing and contrasting isn't just listing facts about topics. It's actually comparing and discussing the similarities and differences between those two things. So don't just list facts about each one and call it good. You have to discuss the similarities and differences for a compare and contrast question. I'm saying that as a warning because my morning classes just listed facts about those objects and said they were good. Keep in mind, it is a short essay, which means that it should be written in an essay format, not in a bullet point list. And you might want to proofread it if you struggle with writing before you submit it. I'm not a huge stickler for minor grammar issues on short essays, but if it's to the point that I can't make out hide or tail what you're trying to say, I'm not going to be able to grade it if I don't understand what point you're trying to make. So keep that in mind. Once again, that's due. The last day to do it is Sunday. I'm going to try and get through tonight early enough like I did last week for those of you that like to go ahead and do it right after the end of class. By the way, those of you that have been doing your stuff immediately after class, your grades have been so good. So those of you that are procrastinating until like Saturday or Sunday to do it, maybe don't. Do it while it's fresh on your brain, because it seems to be working for your classmates to do that. Tonight we are going over craft media and architecture. I'm going to go through craft media kind of quickly. It's a bit of a minor subject, especially considering in the art world, like I said at the beginning of this class, a majority of museums and galleries don't even like to consider craft media as art. So it's interesting when it gets included into textbooks. Okay, the people are finally on. One last thing, those of you that like to cheat on your quizzes, I know that you're cheating on your quizzes because your answers are ridiculous, especially when two people write the same exact absurd answer for a question that has nothing to do with the question that was asked. It's a bit obvious that you are cheating. So yeah, I'd refrain from doing that. I didn't leave notes on your quiz this last week if I caught you. There were two people that did it though, and I'm sure they know who they are. If it's not you, then you don't have to worry about it because it's not you. But it was a really weird answer that both people gave to a particular question. Next time you will not be getting a free pass. Next time you'll just get a 0. So please refrain from doing that again. So sorry, I noticed the person that was the culprit got on, so I wanted to mention that really fast just to warn them, because your next quiz is your final exam. So that would suck if you got a 0 on your final for cheating. Sorry. Back to your lectures for tonight. So to start off with, like I said, we are going to be discussing craft media. Craft media is usually, like I said, not considered a higher art form. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the architectural section tonight because that's what your discussion post is about. So we're going to go through this section a little bit quicker than I would normally. Craft media means we're referring to things that you wouldn't normally go to an art school to learn how to do. You would go to like a trade school or just learn it from someone else by watching them do it, such as looking at your grandmother making quilts and picking up the technique from her. So craft media relates to weaving things, quilting things, metalwork, woodworking, glass blowing, ceramics. There's quite a large amount of objects that fall under craft media. Occasionally, craft media can be elevated from craft into art form. Usually, in order for craft media to meet the requirements to be considered higher art, it has to lose its function or its usefulness. Normally, like it says here, craft is considered as a useful object. Artists try to challenge that notion by making the objects no longer useful. At that point, since they have lost their usefulness, they can only be shown as art. They have no function other than being shown as art. Our first example of craft tonight is a textile wallpaper pattern made by William Morris called Windrush. It is a repeat of a woodblock print. We talked about woodblock prints when we were going over printmaking, primarily used by the Japanese for their ukiyo-e style. Keep in mind that every single layer has to have its own different print. And here is that textile pattern. Like I said, though, in order for something to be elevated from craft to art, it has to lose its function. This is wallpaper, so it still has a function. Therefore, at what point did it become considered become acceptable for it to be exhibited as art? Now, this title, Victorian Albert Museum, is a little bit misleading. It is being shown in a museum, but it's being shown in a particular wing of the museum that specializes in home decor. The Victorian Albert Museum is a pretty interesting place. It's about 8 miles worth of stuff to look at, ranging from theater props to home interior design and fashion and things like that. Now, the first particular medium that we're going to discuss while looking at craft is clay. With clay, there are 3 kinds of clay. There's earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. Porcelain must be fired at a very high temperature in order to make it. It's very fine and delicate, whereas earthenware and stoneware are fired at lower temperatures. Earthenware is fired at the lowest temperature, and then stoneware is the medium one. Stoneware is extremely heavy, so that's how you can differentiate between earthenware and stoneware. But before we get into that, some important terms related to clay is ceramics. Most objects made of clay are called ceramics. So, for example, my early college high school group just turned in their gallery report, and I had one student that repeatedly used the word clay instead of calling the object a ceramic art piece. She referred to it as a clay art piece. And I didn't take out points for that, of course, because that's just super minor and mean and nitpicky. But I did remind her that they're called ceramic pieces. So anything that's made from clay, which includes porcelain, porcelain is a type of clay, falls under the category of ceramics. Anyone that works with clay is called a ceramicist, and ceramicists that specialize in making dishes are called potters. Oftentimes, potters will use something called a potter wheel, which normally at this point in class, we would take a lovely little field trip to the ceramics studio at Midland College, but thanks to our situation presently, we are not going to be going on a field trip. But looking at someone make something with a potter's wheel is really interesting. In order to make something on a potter's wheel, you must first center the clay. If you don't center that clay, it'll be lopsided. And it'll probably end up collapsing on itself while you're making it. You also have to have really large, firm hands in order to really be good at using a potter's wheel, or at least stronger hands. My little tiny arthritic-ridden hands are not very good at making pottery as much as I want them to be. And of course, after you mold your clay into whatever form you want it to take, you would then let it dry out. Some areas that are really humid have to have special rooms for that purpose. But since we live in West Texas, we have the opportunity of just letting our pieces sit out, and they will eventually dry out on their own. Especially in summertime, they can dry out in a couple of hours. After they've dried out, then you would fire that clay at a very high temperature in something called a kiln. There are different kinds of kilns. There's an open fire kiln that uses wood, and there is a raku kiln, which uses gas and combustion. And then there is an electric kiln that uses electricity and works like an oven in your house would. But the temperatures get much, much higher than anything our ovens in our home could get. We're talking about like 1100 degrees here. So like I mentioned earlier, there are 3 different kinds of clay. There's earthenware, which is a low fire temperature pottery. It's very porous. Stoneware is heavier and less porous, and it's fired at a higher temperature. And then porcelain uses a different kind of clay. Porcelain comes in a white form already. Stoneware and earthenware, normally the clay will come in a brown, like it looks like clay, it looks like dirt. Porcelain, on the other hand, is white, and it is a very high temperature firing. It is the highest temperature firing. It's very delicate, and it is the most expensive form of ceramics. Like I said, potters that use potter wheels, that is called throwing when you're using that potter's wheel. You're not actually throwing anything, it's just what it's called. And like I said, you would shape the clay on a potter's wheel, air dry it, fire it. After you've fired it once, then you can glaze it, or you can use a slip. A slip is a mixture of clay and water, and you can paint onto your ceramic piece with that. That slip will give it a different tone. Or you can just use a glaze. A glaze is like a liquid paint. There's different chemical compounds that you use to make different glazes. Also, depending on the kind of kiln process that you're putting your ceramic piece through, you will use a different kind of glaze. Like, for example, if you are doing the electric kiln, you'll probably use something called Neolica to glaze your pottery. If you're using a raku firing method, there's specific raku glazes that you have to use. Also with glazes, some glazes are toxic. So even after the firing process, because you would glaze it and then you'd refire it again. I missed that part. You'll glaze it and then you'll refire it again. But even after it's been fired, those toxins still exist in there. For example, the color purple is extremely toxic in both glassblowing and ceramics. And even after it's been fired onto the object, it is still toxic. So you can't use those particular ceramic pieces, therefore they have lost their function. Artists that have helped to elevate ceramics to a higher art form are people like Betty Woodman and her divided vases, Cubist style. With this, she has used earthenware, low fire clay, the porous one, and she has taken away any sense of function with this piece. She's also made it in relation to a Cubist art style, which you'll learn about later on this semester. The other ceramicist that we're going to look at is Adrian Sachs and his porcelain piece. Porcelain is the high fire one. With this, he has once again also taken away the function of the object. It still looks elegant and beautiful like a regular porcelain piece would, but it has no purpose or function to it. So here is Betty Woodman's Divided Vases Cubist. So people might argue that these could still be used as vases. However, it has no bottom. So if you tried to fill that up with water, you would have a mess. And here is Adrian Sachs. This has like a feeling of like a Fabergé egg to it. So it looks a bit like it's an antique ceramic or porcelain piece. However, it is not. It was made in 2004. Fun thing about ceramics is that you must always leave a hole somewhere on your object because air gets stuck inside. And when you heat air up, my intelligent science people will know that when you heat up oxygen, it expands. So if you don't leave a hole somewhere on this piece, it will explode in the firing process when that air expands. So there is actually a hole on the bottom where that pedestal is, but it has no purpose or function other than looking nice. Continuation of some ceramic artists. We will look at Peter Voulkos as well as Takezu. Voulkos is actually the first artist to try to elevate ceramics to a higher art form. He made plates, however, the plates used a kind of glaze that was toxic, so it's not like you could actually use those plates to eat off of. I mean, you could, but you'd get really sick, so I wouldn't recommend it. So they are useless. They look like they're a usable object, but they are actually useless. And then, of course, Makahablu 2 is another object made with clay that has no function anymore. So here is that untitled plate. And Makahablu 2. Both of these have relations to abstract expressionism, which is another thing that you'll learn about later on in this class. So moving on from clay to glass, specifically we're going to be looking a lot at glass blowing or blown glass. However, other ways that glass has been used throughout time can be seen in things like stained glass windows. Stained glass windows were originally used in churches to try to evoke the feeling of being in a heavenly realm. It's also very pretty to look at too. Of course, blown glass, if you haven't watched someone blow glass before, you should. There's YouTube videos about it, and it's really interesting to watch. It's a very dangerous trade to go into because you literally, there's a little metal pipe, and at one end there's molten hot glass that's sometimes on fire, and at the other end you're blowing into that pipe to try and make forms and shapes. If you accidentally inhale, you'll be inhaling some pretty dangerous chemicals as well as a really hot substance. So it's pretty dangerous. Also, like I said with the clay, certain colors with blown glass are also toxic. So it's a pretty dangerous trade to go into. There's different kinds of glass inlays that you can see in objects throughout time. And now let's take some time to look at some clay, or not clay, glass. Sorry, I was thinking about something with clay. The first glass artist that we're going to look at is Dale Chihuly Seaforms. Dale Chihuly is probably the most well-known glass artist that we have today. He has a piece of art that's at the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas. It's on the ceiling. If you ever go there, you might want to make a note of it. He does really large glass sculptures. A few years ago, he did a show at one of the parks in Dallas. And the thing with Dale Chihuly's pieces is they're all very organic looking. So he had his glass sculptures displayed in and out and around with the natural foliage in the park. So they kind of blended in with the nature surrounding them. It was really a gorgeous and beautiful show. However, there was a hailstorm that year that it was on display, and glass and hail don't work together very well, as I'm sure a lot of us West Texans know. Several of the art pieces were broken. Luckily, they were insured, so money could have been collected on that. Dale Chihuly actually does not make any of his pieces himself. He will paint or sketch his ideas and send them off to a glass blowing factory that actually makes the pieces for him. He makes a lot of money off of them, though, for sure. These particular sculptures right here, a single piece of this would sell for a couple $1,000s. So he makes quite a bit of money off of his art pieces, especially the large ones. Museums will usually have giant chandelier versions of his works in the front. If you go to the Dallas Museum, they have a really nice one as well. Our other glass artist is Mona Hodum, and this is her Nature Morte Ox grenades. And of course, the glass portion is the grenades here, and they are sitting on not a trolley. Every time I talk about this piece, my British side comes out and I say the word trolley. It's a cart or a gurney. That's the word that I'm looking for. Does anyone here have any idea why she might have called it Nature Morte Ox grenades, or what this piece might be about? Any guesses?
Maybe like when it has to do with like the soldiers and stuff using the grenades, or death, or
Yeah.
something.
Definitely, for sure.
That
Yeah, Brock?
the trolley thing looks like, you know, what wounded soldiers would lie on. So
Yeah, it's actually a gurney. I just can never remember the American English word for that. Those of you that don't know, I lived in London for like 2 years, and I picked up some words, and I can't go back to American English now with some things because it just stuck. So I apologize for that. But yeah, Liliana and Brock, you guys are definitely correct. It is referencing death, and death specifically by grenades for things like war. So very good, you two. So they have both Dale Chihuly and Mona Hodum, by the way, in case you didn't catch on, those particular glass pieces have no function anymore. They have become solely just sculptures. Moving on from glass to metal, metalsmiths were really big in Middle Eastern art, and we're going to talk about them. Well, actually, you guys might talk about them if you might have chosen one of them as your pieces for your individual presentation. But Muslim art traditions were the ones that really made metalsmithing an elevated art form. So in Muslim tradition, you are not supposed to show images of biblical figures or people. It's considered a form of idolatry. We're actually going to talk about a few religions that feel that way when we get to the art history section. But because in Islamic faith they felt like that, they focused instead a lot of their art making efforts on trying to show the beauty of foliage and organic forms rather than people. Another belief in Islamic faith is that God made people. How dare you try to match God with trying to portray people? So that's another reason why they don't show people. But because they spent so much time trying to show organic forms, they used some different mediums than what we see with the rest of the world, particularly metalwork, which you can see in the Arenberg Basin. Sorry, my cat got her claw stuck. She freaked out. Here, this was made in particular for a European collector, so that's why there are some people on it, which is pretty rare. But you can see the inlaid silver and brass here, which is very detailed, organic, repetitive forms over and over. A contemporary artist that likes to play on the early Middle Eastern style of using metal work and organic forms is Cal Lane. Cal Lane, however, likes to focus on contemporary issues and topics, which is what we will see with her untitled Map 3, which is actually a 55-gallon drum, which would normally be used for oil, that's been flattened out. Oil, of course, is the source of the world's energy, which is why it is a map of the world. Since oil is the world's energy and where most people make their money these days, it makes sense that there's a map of the world on it. And this is, of course, all metalworking in the form of plasma cut steel. Which, fun fact, Midland College just bought a machine that will do this for us. But my gosh, does it stink when it's running. The smell. Moving on from metalcraft to wood, which I don't know if I would consider any of these crafts since they don't really have their function anymore. But for some reason, your book still puts them under a craft media. I guess just because they're traditionally considered mediums used for crafts. But wood is the only medium that we've discussed so far that once came from a living thing. So the artist Henry Gilpin, with his Curiosity Red, does like to play on that idea of wood being a living thing. It's something that you carve. It's something that you can shape. It's very versatile, abundant. You can paint it, you can stain it. There's different kinds of wood that are more softer or harder or more malleable. It just depends on which one you're wanting to go with. For Curiosity Red, Henry Gilpin took an elm tree nearby his studio that had a twisted grain to the trunk of it, and he used that twisted grain to make his piece. It is a table that he has stained red, and if you'll notice, the stain is dripping down to resemble blood. Once again, to reiterate that wood came from a living thing, and it's also a meditation on life and death, the life and death of the tree specifically. And here is that Curiosity Red. That's still not spelled right, but whatever. I'll fix it later. And you can see at the bottom of the legs, the stain is dripped down. Our other wood artist is Liv Blavarp. Liv Blavarp does make pieces that can be used, which, by the way, this one obviously can't be used because the tabletop is so warped that anything you put on it would probably fall off. But Liv Blavarp does actually make things you can use. She makes jewelry. She makes jewelry that resembles animals based on folk traditions in her native Norway. And here are her animal necklaces. Well, one of them. Moving on from wood to fiber, which is the last craft media that we're going to discuss in this section. Fiber arts can be a couple things. There's two classes for fiber art. One is on loom and one is off loom. On loom means that they used a loom to weave their object. And I'm saying that and I'm realizing, because my last class didn't know what a loom was, that there's probably people in here as well that don't know what a loom is. So let me pull up a picture really fast, just so that everyone knows what I'm talking about. Because it does make a difference when I get to the next section. Which, by the way, if there ever is something that I mention and you're like, what the heck is she talking about? Let me know, because sometimes I don't realize what people know and don't know, just because I've been doing this for so long that I kind of forget. But this is a loom. So you'll notice that there are fibers or strings that are going vertically. Those are warp fibers, W-A-R-P, and the fibers that are being woven in and out horizontally are called weft fibers, W-E-F-T. So if you are making something on or off loom, either way, you will have warp fibers and weft fibers. And it is the process of weaving in which you make fiber art. And my PowerPoint disappeared. Well, shucks. Here we go. Okay, so like I said, there's two kinds of fiber art. There's with loom, which is what that machine was that we just saw a picture of, and then there's off loom. Off loom can be like basket weaving or something along those lines, because you wouldn't want to use a machine like that that keeps things flat for a basket, which is supposed to be round. The idea of weaving, like I mentioned, is interlacing different fibers. Warp fibers are the ones that go vertically, weft fibers go horizontally. I always remember that because the F and the T, I have to cross them, so they must be the ones that go this way. And that's for anyone that might ever have to take a test in art, because that's always on a test. I don't know why. So you can make fiber art super simple, or you can make it super complex, such as Persian rugs. Persian rugs are made on loom. The Ardabil carpet, made once again by Middle Eastern artists in Persia, made this Persian rug on loom quite a while ago, back in 1540. Contemporary examples of, actually, before we get to contemporary, another example of weaving that you would do on a loom is a tapestry. We mentioned tapestries briefly when I went over cartoons. To do a tapestry, because it's so big, you would not want to have to go back and change your design halfway through, because you'd have to literally start over. So oftentimes people will do cartoons, which a refresher of what a cartoon is it's a like life-size image of what you're planning on making, drawn out and sketched out ahead of time. But normally you would make a cartoon before you actually weave your tapestry, just to refrain from any mistakes possibly happening. An example of a large contemporary tapestry is Laura Baladi's tapestry that we're about to look at. It uses really famous art history pictures in it. Hundreds of them, actually, all combined into like a collage format. Normally collage is when you stick something onto a paper. However, she has woven these in. This was made using a digitally operated loom, meaning that she programmed her design into a computer program beforehand, and then the loom did the hard stuff. Well, not really. She had to come up with the design and figure out how to program it in. But the loom actually made it. And here's a close-up of one of the images on it. Another example of fiber art can be seen in quilting. Quilting was traditionally considered women's work, and it kind of still is considered women's work. Feminist artists have been trying to get quilting accepted into museums and galleries since the 70s, and really been pushing for it and fighting for it. In fact, feminist artists started to try to implement quilting into their own artwork since they were already famous. They tried to help other women artists become famous by displaying things like quilting in their pieces. A great example of that is Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. But another example of that is Personal Appearance number 3, which we're about to look at here by Miriam Shapiro. Miriam Shapiro was already, by 1973, a pretty well-known feminist artist that was getting gallery shows. So she decided to use her platform to try and elevate a different art style that was normally considered craft done by women in their homes as a hobby by incorporating it into her art style. And then our next one is going to be Polly Applebaum's Flatterland Funky Town. This has woven together different pieces of velvet. For those of you that don't know what quilting is, it's literally just weaving together different pieces of fabric to make a design, which you can see here with Miriam Shapiro's. You can make out the different fabric textures and colors that she wove together to make the design. And of course, here you can also see it with Polly Applebaum's Flatterland Funky Town. Once again, this is velvet pieces that have been woven or quilted together. She has chosen to, instead of display things on a wall, she has put it on the ground. It acts almost as if it's a sculpture, and the viewer would walk around it and see all of it instead of having it displayed on a wall. So also she's challenging here what a sculpture is. And our last, I do believe, example of quilting or fiber art is from Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold is a very, very well-known African-American female artist who now writes children's books and illustrates them. But she started off making story quilts. These story quilts stitch in stories from her own life and tell us about her childhood and important events in her life. For example, Tar Beach. She grew up in a city and her family could not afford to go to the beach like the other people's families could. So instead, during the summers, what they would do is they would go to the roof of their building and pretend it was a beach, basically. They'd set out a blanket, they'd have a barbecue, and it became their own little private tar beach, which, like I said, she makes her own children's books and illustrates them, so she has made Tar Beach into a children's book. And here is that illustration. At the top and the bottom, she has the story that you can read. That was a very, very fast run through of craft media, but that's because I wanted to, like I said, pay a little bit more attention to your architecture section, since that's where your discussion question comes from. Architecture does have a large amount of vocabulary with it, unlike the craft media section. So be prepared when we get back from our break to write a lot of definitions if you need to. I'll post them in the chat as well, like I have been, for those of you that are trying to keep up with that. Otherwise, we will take a break until 6:20, and then we'll come back and go through architecture.
Hey, Miss.
Yes.
My brother wasn't feeling so good, so he had to go. I just want to give you a heads up.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
He's not the only one. There's a couple of people that emailed me saying that they weren't feeling good today.
Yeah, I don't know. I touched his forehead. I think he has a little bit of a fever. I don't know.
That's not
So, yeah. So I just told him, I was like, just go to your room and just try to relax. So I told him I would take notes for us. So
yeah.
Miss,
Yes, Beyonce.
do you mind going back to the glass artist slide while we have the break so I can write it down?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
give me a second. Which glass artist? Just the one with the description?
Yes, ma'am.
You'll have to tell me which one in a second because there's two.
The
Is it this one or the next one?
at the beginning it says Dali Chichuli. However you say that name. Yes, ma'am, that one right there. Thank you.
No problem. This is the perfect time to do that. It's also the perfect time for someone to ask questions if they have any.
Is the quad finals like the next week or when?
What do you mean?
Like you were saying earlier, like the finals is coming. So when is that?
No, your next test is your final.
So is it in December? You're
Yes.
saying? Oh wow. Oh, okay.
You have a bunch of discussion posts and a couple of papers. There's
Okay.
no quizzes until then.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, don't confuse me because my 8-week courses actually do have their finals this week. So I was like, huh? I'm a little brain fried tonight because I'm getting them ready for their finals. And I spent a good chunk of, well, actually, I spent the entire day yesterday from like 7 in the morning until 5 at night grading 30 essays so that they could have their grades ready before their final so that they knew that they were okay with the class. Or if they weren't okay with the class, but I think everyone was. That and there was an issue with the final when I went through it again. So that wasn't helpful.
Can you go to the next one, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
This one you were wanting, Beyonce?
Oh no, can you, I'm sorry.
That?
Yes, thank you.
And as soon as Beyonce is done with this, we'll go ahead and start back up. The next section, like I said, is architecture. I can go ahead and start you guys off with the key terms in the chat. For those of you that like that.
Okay, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. And I posted these terms in the chat already. How this one's going to work out, it's going to be me giving you these key terms, and then we'll look at different architectural examples of these terms. So as we go on, if we look at the example and you're still confused as to what that word in particular means, stop me and ask, and I will try my best to come up with a better way of explaining it for you. Like I said, this is the particular section that your discussion post is going to come from. And I'm hoping at the end to give you guys enough time to work on your discussion post. And I'm also hoping that I can help you guys out with it at the end too, if we have enough time. But to start us off, we'll go over these key terms. We're starting with super basic key terms, and then we'll keep getting a little bit more complex with them. And there's actually 2 pages of key terms with this one. Like I said, there's a lot. Starting off with masonry. Masonry is just piling stones to make a structure. There's dry masonry, and then there's a dressed masonry. Dressing stones means that you're shaping those stones to fit in their particular spot. For example, I was reading a good long article about how the Egyptians shaped their stones for the Great Pyramids, like the method. They would use other stones to smooth out and polish those stones before they put them in so that they'd be the right shape and size. They also used a lot of chisels, and the chisels got worn out so quickly that they often had to replace them before they even finished a single stone. So that was interesting to read about. But dressing stones just means you're shaping your stone and getting it ready for its spot. Post and beam, or what I like to refer to as post and lintel, is using 2 posts to hold up a beam or 2 posts to hold up a lintel. It's a very basic architectural form or style. I'll see if I can. No, we'll look at an example later. Post and beam is very easy to comprehend. If you're still confused, you'll understand when we get to a picture. There's a cartoon image that's really good at explaining it. The next key term is arch. An arch is a round version of a post and beam or post and lintel. And the thing that holds an arch together is something called a capstone, which is right there, or a keystone, which is at the very top point or the highest point of that arch. Arches are invented by the Romans, and we'll look at one of their early examples of arches. Columns are used by the Greeks and actually invented by the Egyptians, and the Greeks ended up stealing it from the Egyptians and making it really well known, and then the Romans steal it from the Greeks. But columns are just beams or posts, and a colonnade is a row of continuous columns. A pier is a very large, fat, thick column. A barrel vault is multiple arches on top of arches to make a long tunnel. Basically, it's a row of arches that make a tunnel. An arcade is a series of arches that are supported by columns on each side. Basically, not all the time do your arches have columns. Sometimes they are just part of the whole building and there's not actually columns supporting them, just the rest of the building. Which, like I said, we'll see examples of all these in a second. I'm putting this in the chat too. If I seemed a bit distracted, that's why. Keystone is another word for a capstone. Like I said, it's the final stone placed at the top of an arch. Concrete is a material that was introduced by the Romans. It was really useful for architectural purposes. Of course, later on we invent steel, which is even better. Concrete is extremely heavy, but it's durable. Minarets are towers. You will mostly see minarets with Islamic architecture. Normally, there will be 4 minarets to indicate your directional location, because in Islamic faith, you're supposed to pray towards Mecca. So that way you can figure out which direction you're at. And then, of course, a Gothic arch is like an arch, except for it has a point at the top. So arch, Gothic arch, arch, Gothic arch. And then a truss is a triangular support seen in a roof during the Gothic era of architecture. The Gothic era isn't known for much, but they do invent a lot of interesting architectural features. So a good chunk of the architecture we're going over tonight comes from either the Romans or the Gothic era. But trusses are triangular supports that are used with arches in Gothic art and architecture, which will make sense, I promise. I promise all of these words will make sense. We're going to start off architecture looking at the dolmen, which is one of the very first examples of architecture that we have. It was made around 40,000 BCE, so it's really, really, really old. And it uses a post and beam architectural feature. So we have 3 posts here and a beam over top. This was used for housing or to shelter you from the elements. Sorry. With architecture throughout the rest of this course, I'll be referring to things like form and function. Function is how a building will be used. Form is how a building looks. Structure is how it stands up. Of course, this particular structure is being held up by posts. The form is very basic, and the function was to keep you out of the elements. Occasionally throughout architectural history, we prioritize form. Sometimes we prioritize function. It depends on the style and the era. For example, when we get to the international style of architecture, we, during that time period, prioritized function over form. We didn't really care how much a building looked or what it looked like or how fancy it was or the decorations. We cared more about the purpose of the building and what it was going to be used for. So form and function are very important terms to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this class until December. Would you guys have liked to, or would you guys feel comfortable sitting under that dolmen? Yes or no?
No
You guys
way.
spend the night? No? Why
I
not?
think so.
Why not, Liliana?
I don't know. I don't know. I just feel like it wouldn't be that sturdy, I guess. I don't know.
What do you think, Brock? You were on mute.
I would, because they are like it looks stable. Like there's already 3 points of contact, like from
Yeah.
the ground.
I'm with
Yes.
Brock. I mean, if it's been standing since the Stone Age and it has yet to fall, I think it's probably pretty sturdy. But oftentimes people side with Liliana saying that it doesn't look structurally sound. But I'm with Brock. I think it's pretty good. If it's been up this long, it's probably going to last for a while longer. There's quite a few dolmens located around Europe, by the way. This isn't the only one. Moving on from our dolmen to traditional things used in architecture, meaning early architecture. So we're not talking about steel or concrete yet. The most basic things used were wood, stone, and later on bricks. Wood, of course, is light, stone is heavy, so you can probably figure out what would be the bottom of your structure and what would probably be the top. Any guesses?
The stone would be the bottom.
Yeah. That being said, we're about to look at a structure that no longer has a roof. That's because the roof was wood, and wood being light is also not as durable and doesn't last as long. So there's not a roof anymore. There would have originally been a roof in the structure that we're about to look at. The structure we're going to look at uses dry masonry, which is the idea of interloping and interlocking different stones to build something. Stone dressing is also used in this particular building right here. This is the Great Zimbabwe, located in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe itself actually means great house. So that can give you an idea of what this particular structure would have originally been used for. Here's a closer interior view of Great Zimbabwe. So you can see here, there are interlocking stones. These stones, I'm trying to blow it up a little bit bigger, have been shaped to a certain extent to fit into their specific slot. And you can see that they've kind of been stacked on top of each other. Once again, this would have originally had a roof. The roof was wood and it didn't last. Another example of using dry masonry as well as stone shaping is the pyramids. The Great Pyramids specifically definitely use stone shaping. In Giza. I'm just going to be showing you different examples of stone stacking and shaping the stones into fitting into their spots now from different cultures. Does anyone have any questions about shaping stones or stacking them, which is dry masonry? Another people group that use dry masonry is the culture that created the lovely ruins on Machu Picchu in Peru, as well as the Pueblo people from Mesa Verde. They also used dry masonry and shaping stones. So different cultures from around the world from early time periods have been using that particular form of architecture. The next form of architecture that we're going to look at is a post and lintel or a post and beam. Post and beam is literally just posts and a beam. Oftentimes they will support a roof over top, like you can see here. It's a very fundamental old ancient style of architecture that even that dolmen used. And here's just a cartoon image to pare it down for you even better. We see our posts and our lintel or beam over top. Can anyone think of a really famous architectural feature that uses a post and lintel? That's possibly in Ireland or Scotland, sorry. Not Ireland. It's in Scotland. No one? Come on, it looks just like this. Odessa has a replica at UTPB.
Stonehenge.
Thank you, Rock. Stonehenge uses post and lintel construction. So this is just to reiterate the fact that that has been around for a very long time. And I'm not going to talk too much about Stonehenge because next week we start art history and we have to talk about Stonehenge. So I don't like going over it twice when I don't have to. Our next example of an architectural feature is a colonnade. A colonnade is just a row of columns. These objects right here are columns. Columns, once again, originated from the Egyptians, but made famous by the Greeks. The Greeks had 3 different kinds of columns. They had a Doric column, a Corinthian column, and an Ionic column, which once again, we'll talk about more when we get to the Greek art history section. But a colonnade is just a row of columns. And in the very back of this picture, peeking out, you can see the dome of Florence Cathedral in Florence, Italy. Dome, I do believe, is our next topic. Yes. So a dome is a round structure placed on the top, basically as a cap on a building, which once again, you can kind of see peeking up right here. This colonnade, by the way, actually forms a keyhole because in like Catholic religion, there is an idea or a story that Christ gave the keys to the church to Peter or Saint Peter, this colonnade is supposed to represent the keyhole that that key is supposed to go into. But that's just a little side story. We don't get to talk about that, so I thought I'd add that in. We don't get to talk about this structure either. Of course, the gold gilded part on the top is what is actually the dome. Domes were a architectural feature originated in Rome. Like I mentioned, a good chunk of the architecture that we're going to be talking about tonight comes from the Romans, starting with the dome. Does anyone know what this building is? What the name of it is?
Dome of the Rock.
Yes. How did you know that, Brock?
I just learning from history, like Tapestry of Grace is what I give credit to them. So
Very good. Yeah, I think you're the first person that I've ever gotten an answer from when I've asked that question. I always ask it hoping someday someone will know. So thank you, Brock. So yes, this is called the Dome of the Rock. So not only does it have a dome on top, but it has it in the name. This is a very important religious site for the Islamic faith, for the Christian faith, and for the Jewish faith. And if you're really interested in world religions, I would definitely recommend you looking a little bit deeper into the Dome of the Rock because it has a very interesting history, considering what every single one of those religions claims happened there and why they constantly fight over this particular architectural feature. Yeah. And here's a little bit closer picture of that Florence Cathedral dome. This particular dome actually collapsed in on itself while it was being created. The architect, Brancusi, was hired during the Renaissance, well, late Renaissance era, to try and create a dome. And every time he tried to do it, they wanted like a dome so big that the materials being used couldn't support that particular angle that they were wanting because they wanted it so tall that it just kept collapsing in on itself. And eventually they figured out how to do it though, eventually, after a few tries. Of course, this itself isn't actually a true dome because they had to add this on top. We'll look at another example next week of a building called the Pantheon that has a dome on the top, but it cannot be considered a true dome because it has to have an oculus in the center. And here's a different view of that colonnade. Any questions about domes or colonnades or columns? No. Okay. Moving on then to our next term, which is arches. There are a bunch of different kinds of arches, but lucky for you, there's only two that you need to know for this class. The only two you need to know are the basic Roman arch, which can be seen right here. That stone at the very top in the center is the capstone or the keystone. And then the other arch that you need to know about for this class is the Gothic arch, which also has two capstones or keystones at the top that meet together. You have to have a capstone or a keystone there it's physics. So without that capstone or keystone, the arch would collapse in on itself. It's there bracing and carrying the weight of the other stones. And once again, arches were made by the Romans. So domes and arches were created by them. However, they made the Roman arch. The other variations of arches were created later on. We will see later on an example of the trefoil arch and the lancet or Gothic arch when we get to Chartres Cathedral. But here is the fun, easy example of an arch. This is the Pont du Gard, located in Nimes, France. This was created by the Romans when they had a very, very large Roman Empire that expanded all the way up into Great Britain, which is why this is in France. And of course, it has a series of arches, Roman arches specifically. This is an aqueduct. Does anyone know what an aqueduct is or what purpose it serves?
In the ancient Roman times, they had water come through,
Yeah.
like fresh water from the mountains.
Yeah, that's exactly what an aqueduct does. It carries fresh water to the cities or towns. So in France, the town that was under the Roman Empire's control was nowhere near fresh water. So they had to figure out some form of system to take it to the town. However, there was a large ravine. This is a lot deeper than it actually looks in this image. That kind of was preventing them from usually using their normal methods. So they had to make the Pont du Gard, which is, of course, arches on top of arches on top of arches. It still actually carries water today. I mean, no one uses the water, but there's still water going through it. And another example of an arch that we can see throughout time is triumphal arches. This is the Triumphal Arch in Paris, but there's a lot of different triumphal arches. Pretty much any major city you ever go to, you'll probably come across one. A triumphal arch usually just celebrates a military victory of some sort. And here you see the arch. There's also arches on each side of this one as well. And here we have our example of a Gothic arch, which just has a point at the top. Gothic arches come about in the Gothic era. And here is our Gothic building that we're going to look at, which is the Notre Dame de Chartres Cathedral. Now, the issue here that I feel like people are probably going to have is that you're going to think it's Notre Dame, the Notre Dame in Paris. but there are several Notre Dames. It literally just means that it was a building dedicated to Mary or the Virgin Mary. So there's quite a few different Notre Dames in France. This particular Notre Dame Cathedral is not the one that's in Paris. This is the one that is in Chartres, France, which is about 100 miles away from Paris. Actually, I don't even think it's 100 miles away. I think it's about an hour away. But here on this building, you see 3 Gothic arches at the entrance, as well as arches around the building. You see 2 towers. The fun thing about this particular cathedral's towers is that one of the towers, the one in the front here, was built at the very beginning of the Gothic era, while the other tower actually burns down. So when they rebuilt it, it was rebuilt in the style that was popular at the end of the Gothic era. So with this Notre Dame Cathedral, we see an example of early Gothic architecture as well as the end of the Gothic era's architecture, which was stylistically a little bit more ornate than early Gothic architecture. We also see a lovely rose window of stained glass here at the front. A rose window just means a round window. Once again, stained glass windows were used in churches to try and create an effect of making it feel like you were in a heavenly place while you were inside of the church. So during the Gothic era, churches started using these stained glass windows to try and bring in more light, because light was representational of heaven and God. But the issue is when you add a whole bunch of windows to a solid concrete and stone building, it takes away a lot of the supports. So they had to, during the Gothic era, come up with a different method of supporting the structures. If they want to add windows, they got to figure out something else to do, because that glass isn't strong enough to support the walls in the way they need to be. So instead, they do something called barrel vaults, which you can kind of see here. But here's a close-up of barrel vaults. So what barrel vaults do is they actually take the weight off of the walls and send the weight out to the side. So taking the pressure off of that wall so that you can have those windows and distributing that weight outside to other areas. I also like to think of it as like an external skeletal system. I don't know why, maybe because I started off in biology, that might be why. And here we see the tops of some more Gothic arches. These are used as window decorations. So with this building, we definitely see that form was prioritized over function. We'll see that change later on in architectural history. But these people were definitely more concerned with how the building looked and how the building made people feel than the structure of the building. And here's an interior. Prior to the Gothic era in churches, they did not use very many windows, so there wasn't a need for those external supports that we just looked at. And here's some more arches. I need to get a new picture for that one. You can see a column there. And moving on from the Chartres Cathedral to this one, this is Hagia Sophia, done quite a bit earlier than the previous building, but this is our example of minarets. Minarets, once again, are towers predominantly seen in Islamic architecture. They reference the 4 cardinal directions. You can also see a lovely display of domes here. This was built during the Byzantine era, which predates the Gothic era by quite a bit. Rome still existed at this point in time. They had just divided into a couple of different empires. There's an Eastern and a Western Empire. And if we have time at the end, we will watch a little video about it that I feel will probably help you guys out on your discussion post. Hagia Sophia was originally a Christian church made once again during the Roman Empire when Christianity was accepted in the Roman Empire. There was a point in time that it was illegal, and then it was legalized during Constantine, and then the Roman Empire split into two, and they decided to move the capital of Rome to Byzantium, which is why it's called Byzantine art. And that's a lovely little side note that you don't really need yet. You'll need it later, but not yet. And for their new capital of Byzantium, they had the Hagia Sophia built. Originally, the Hagia Sophia did not look like this. It burns down a couple of times due to riots. And of course, originally it did not have these minarets. That was added later on when Muslims took over. And originally on the interior of the Hagia Sophia, there would have been a lot of biblical figures. For example, there was a very large fresco of Christ being shown as the Panto creator, or the creator of all. That no longer exists, as well as some of the other religious images have been removed. There are still some there, and they have been replaced with some more Islamic related iconography, which you can kind of see. And moving on from that to a few different art styles that we don't get to talk about too much in this class. So we are done with the key terms for a bit, and now we're moving on to different styles in architecture. Starting with Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau is a French style of architecture that came around in the 1800s. It is all about trying to portray things as organic forms. The predominant Art Nouveau artist was Antonio Gaudi. Most of his architectural pieces are in Barcelona, Spain. He does have some throughout the rest of Spain. But this is his Dragon House, which, if you are looking, it kind of has a bit of a skeletal structure going on here, like vertebrae. The roof of the house looks like dragon scales. The interior of the house also has like a life-like feeling to it, like it should be some sort of a creature or a monster. Of course, it uses a lot of tile and mosaic work to give it that effect, which you can kind of see on the exterior here. Another example of one of Gaudi's buildings is the Sagrada Familia Church. This is not the way the church originally looked. It was originally a Gothic church done in a similar style to the Chartres Cathedral. However, Gaudi was tasked with redoing that church, and he did it in, of course, his Art Nouveau style, which once again uses a lot of organic, natural architectural features. Here's a close-up of that Sagrada Familia. Gaudi himself actually died before this was finished. It's technically still being worked on today. And here's the interior that's supposed to, the columns are supposed to look like trees. Basically, he was trying to make it look like it had just risen up from the mud or the ground. And it'd always been there. It wasn't man-made. It was what he was trying to make it look like. Another style of art that we don't get to talk about very much, actually we won't get to talk about this one again at all, is the Chicago style. The Chicago style was, of course, invented in Chicago and predominantly used in the United States, and it was mostly used for commercial buildings, i.e. businesses. Because it was mostly used for business purposes, there was not much attention to form. And most of the attention was put into function and making sure the structure of the building supported the function, i.e. cubicles and business type things. There ended up, at this point in time, this is around when steel was invented. And because of steel, buildings could be made taller than they'd ever been made before. So there ended up being a competition between Chicago and New York on who could make the tallest building. Chicago had won briefly with the Sears Tower, however, New York quickly overtook them. But here is one of Louis Sullivan's early buildings. Louis Sullivan is the artist that kind of kicks off this Chicago style and using steel in architecture. But you can see it's basically a box with windows. And here is the Wainwright building, also done by Louis Sullivan as well as Adler. It's a box. Most of Chicago style, as well as the international style that we're about to talk about, it's all about boxes. The Chicago style, it looks and feels like a box. The international style tries a little bit harder to make it not feel like a box, even though it is a box. This one, however, does have a little bit of a Greek reference to it. We haven't talked about this yet, but on Greek temples, there's something called a frieze, which is a series of sculptures that you would find in a ribbon across the top of the building or the temple, which you can see is echoed here. Here's a close-up of that. So there was a little bit of detail added to the decor of the building. And of course, like I said, the international style is very similar to the Chicago style in the sense that we're still using boxes or box cube shapes. However, the international style tries to elevate that by making it not feel so much like a box by adding a large amount of windows. The first artist to make use of the international style is Le Corbusier, and this is his very first building, Villa Savoy, which is actually a house. Another example of international style can be seen in Walter Gropius's Bauhaus, which once again is a box, but it makes use of a lot of windows to make it feel a little bit less closed off. International style is what you would most associate skyscrapers with today. Here's another example of the international style. This is another home. This one's by Philip Johnson. It's a glass box. I don't know what to tell you about international style. And international style is still going strong today too. There's a lot of architects that prefer it. Mies van der Rohe, another example. Both Philip Johnson and Mies van der Rohe do a really good job of trying to open up that box-like shape and make it feel a lot bigger. So they're really good at the international style. And of course, international style in what we would most associate it with today, which is a skyscraper. Now, what America is most well known for, and the most well-known architect in America, is Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright invents something called the Prairie House style. What a Prairie House style is, it is a flat, one-floor house. Very long, flat, one-story house. That's Prairie House style. A lot of the houses here are done in Prairie House style. Occasionally, the Prairie House style will also have a cantilevered roof, which is what you see here. A cantilevered roof just means the roof continues on past the house, and it's usually used for things like patios or carports or things like that. So the house ends and the roof continues. That's all a cantilevered roof is. This particular house is called the Roby House. It was made in the 1920s, actually the same exact year that the Model T came out. So if you can picture a Ford Model T automobile parked out front of this house, then you are on the right track, because that's what it would have looked like. This particular house is located in Chicago, and you can totally go visit it if you were ever in Chicago. The interior is still exactly the way it was when Frank Lloyd Wright first built the house. He designed the interior and picked out all of the furniture, and it is not allowed to be changed. You can actually purchase Frank Lloyd Wright buildings to live in, but you are not allowed to change any of the interior. That's one of the things that you have to agree when you buy one of his homes. And there are a good chunk of Frank Lloyd Wright homes in the Midwestern area of America. Here's another image of the Roby House, the interior of it. Another house that Frank Lloyd Wright did that is located in Pennsylvania is called Falling Waters. Falling Waters is quite a bit different from his normal prairie house style. Number one, it has more than one floor. Number two, he designed this around a waterfall. So he took into account the location. The house itself is literally built on the riverbed, the stone used in the riverbed naturally, and the waterfall goes through the bottom area of the house, which you can see here. So because he wanted to use the natural stone bedrock found around the river, a lot of the interior has a lot of organic materials and a lot of stone. He's also included a lot more windows in this home than he would normally include. And nobody ever talks about this home, and I don't know why, but I think it's the most gorgeous home that he has is Falling Waters in Pennsylvania. And that's actually it for the architecture section, but I do want to play a couple of videos for anyone that's willing to stick around. So your discussion post for this week has you comparing and contrasting the Chartres Cathedral and Hagia Sophia. Keep in mind, once again, that comparing and contrasting means that you're doing more than just listing facts about those two buildings, but you actually have to discuss their similarities and differences. Since this particular chapter is about architecture, I would prefer if you focused a bit more on architectural similarities and differences, but feel free to branch out with that and include some information about like what the buildings were used for, or some of the history behind them. That's fine too, but make sure to try to include some architecture since that's what this chapter is focused on. But I do have two short videos. Well, actually they're not short, they're about 10 minutes each, about each of those buildings. For anyone that's interested in sticking around and watching those, it would probably really help you guys out on your discussion posts that you have to do. But if you don't want to stick around for videos, because I know some people don't like to watch videos in classes, do not feel like you have to. This is just if you want to. But keep in mind that discussion post is due on Sunday if you do leave. And I'm going to start with the Hagia Sophia since it is built first. Are there any questions about stuff before I start this for people that don't want to stick around? No? Okay.
full of buildings throughout history that have changed the way we see architecture.
And we're standing in one of them. We're in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, what was once Constantinople.
And before that was Byzantium.
First it was a Greek city, then part of the Roman Empire, and then Constantine decided to found a city here.
Which he called the New Rome, and which came to be known as Constantinople.
Or the city of Constantine. And that happened right at the time that Constantine was recognizing Christianity. By the end of that century, Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman Empire.
The emperor had his palace close by, and that was the reason that the most important church was built here. Now, the church that we're standing in is not that original church. That burned down.
And so did the next church.
They were actually burned during riots, and the most famous riot took place in the 6th century, and it's called the Nika riot.
Against the emperor of the time, Justinian, and Justinian was the patron of this church.
Well, this church was a way of putting to work a lot of people in the city that might otherwise riot, but it was also a way for him to express his power across the empire.
This was one of many churches that Justinian built. This building, though, is the centerpiece of that building program.
It's unbelievable. We're standing in this mountain of a building, and in fact, to use that kind of geologic term is, I think, appropriate. One author said that standing here where we are in the sanctuary was like standing at the bottom of an enormous canyon. Now, when this was built in the 6th century, it was absolutely unique in the world, not only for its scale, not only for its ambition, but also for its design.
Justinian hired two theoreticians, two scholars who were well versed in geometry and mathematical theory and physics to think about how to vault this space. The two churches that were here before had wooden roofs.
Well, those were basic basilica structures, a kind of architecture that the ancient Romans were very comfortable with. We see that kind of architecture throughout the Roman Empire, and so it would have been very familiar to the Roman emperors Constantine and Justinian.
But Justinian asked his architects to do something different, and instead of building a traditional basilica, he had them build something that unified a centrally planned space with a basilica space. So a basilica has a longitudinal format, and a centrally planned space is based more on a circle.
Let's talk about the basic geometries here. We have a dome that is phenomenally high. If you think about how the Romans handled domes, and they did build very large dome structures, think about the Pantheon in Rome, but in that case, you have a round dome sitting directly on a round barrel. This building is doing something much different. This dome is on a square. And so how in the world do you put the base of a round dome onto a square building?
And from that square base emerges two half domes forming a rectangle of space that reminds us of a basilica.
So how have they done it? Well, they've done it with something called a pendentive. If you look at the base of the dome, you see that it comes down on a series of 4 arches, and the space between the 4 arches and the base of the dome, it's kind of a triangle, but it's curved. And so this miraculous thing happens. We know that dome must weigh an enormous amount, and yet it seems to come down on the slenderest of points.
What the architects did was hide the enormous stone piers that are doing most of the work of supporting the weight and the thrust of that dome. Domes exert an enormous amount of pressure not only down but also out. Part of the work of supporting the dome is also being done by the half domes on either side, and on the east end, 3 smaller half domes below that. This is the first time we see the dome on pendentives on this monumental scale.
And it was dangerous. It was incredibly ambitious, but it didn't work perfectly at first.
No, there was an earthquake, part of the dome collapsed, and when it was rebuilt, it was redesigned. The dome that we see now is taller than the dome that was here originally.
By making it steeper, it allows some of the lateral force to be reduced so that the weight comes more vertically down. But the enormous thrust really did destabilize the building. And if you look carefully, you can actually see some columns and other structural elements have been pushed askew.
So here we are talking about the engineering
Engineering marvel.
But when you're inside the space, you don't think about that. You think about the complexity of the space, the mysteriousness of the space, the way that the walls dissolve into light, the mysticism of this space.
Well, that's what this was all about. In fact, an early chronicler said it seems as if the dome is suspended from heaven. And part of the reason for that is, and this is just so incredibly ambitious, the architects pierced the base of the dome with 40 windows so that light streams in under the dome. You begin to lose the structural elements between the windows, and it seems almost to be continuous light.
Light in Byzantine thinking is connected with ideas of perfection and the divine.
The windows create a rhythm that almost sets the dome in motion. And then all of that is resting on walls that are clad with marble that have rich veins and patterns that are all in motion. The floor is made of huge paving stones that seem as if it's almost a pattern of waves.
It lacks the solidity of ancient Roman architecture. Here we have a new Christian architecture for a new Christian Roman Empire.
For me, it is the perfect expression of the transformation of the physical into the spiritual. This is a building that was the spiritual heart of the empire.
The emperor in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, which really was a continuation of the Roman Empire, but with vast amounts of territories that had been lost, that emperor was not just a political figure. He was also the head of the church. He appointed the patriarch, the man in charge of the church. This is very different than when we think about the Pope in the western part of the empire.
And so when important rites took place in this church and the emperor and the patriarch came together, it was an expression of the unity of heaven and earth, of political power and spiritual power. We were talking about the way that this building is an expression of mystery, and its structural qualities are beautifully hidden. One of the things that attracts our eye from the structure is the surface decoration. All of the upper surfaces that are not colored stone were covered with gold mosaic.
Mosaic that had decorative patterns.
Acanthus leaves, palm leaves. You could find crosses everywhere. What you couldn't find was mosaics that showed figures. This was a period in Byzantine history that was leading up to what we call the iconoclasm, which was a point where there was a real crisis of images. When this church was built, it was a clear decision to avoid any kind of figural imagery.
The decision might have been because of concerns around the commandment against creating graven images, but it also may have been to highlight the architecture. Instead of drawing your attention to Mary or Christ, but instead drawing your attention to the overall mystical effect of the space itself.
The color wasn't just from the mosaics. All of this clear glass was originally colored. It was red, it was yellow, it was purple, it was blue, it was green. And then you have the surface of the marbles. Justinian paid an enormous amount of money to import marbles from across his empire. He's brought the most beautiful, most elegant marbles that he could, and he's embedded them in the walls, what we call revetment. And his workmen were able to saw these pieces of marble crosswise and then open them up like leaves of a book so that the patterns were actually mirrors, creating these wonderful complex patterns. And so you have light streaming in the windows, gold mosaics, these colored marbles, all of which created this kaleidoscope of movement and energy.
When the emperor stood with the patriarch of the Orthodox Church in this space, they wore gold and purple and silver.
And there were gems embedded in the thrones. There was an enormous screen that protected the sanctuary. And by some accounts, it was 35 feet high, completely covered in silver.
And so you had the laity, normal people like us, standing in the aisles and the galleries above. And then only the patriarch, the priest, the clergy, and the emperor were allowed in this space that, as you said, was screened. And so you had a mystery within this mysterious space. What a spectacle.
This building is almost 1,500 years old, so it's gone through a lot of changes.
Change is visible all around us. The floors are worn and uneven. Parts of the marble revetment are lost and have been painted instead. There's clearly mosaics that date from different periods of time. Most obviously, there are Islamic inscriptions in the dome from when this building was made into a mosque.
The Byzantine Empire was ultimately conquered by the Ottoman Turks, who were Muslims, and this city city, Constantinople, was the great treasure. And the great gem in that city was this church. And so when this city was conquered, one of the first things they did was transform it into a mosque.
And this functioned as a mosque until 1934, when it was secularized and made into a museum.
What we've lost mostly, though, is all of the original Christian furnishings.
And not just furnishings, but relics, reliquaries. This was a space that was filled with holy objects.
And the reason for this is not when the Muslims invaded. The reason for this is when the Western European Christians invaded.
Right, and that happened in 1204.
Instead of going to the Holy Land,
To take back the Holy Land from the Muslims.
the Crusaders owed the Venetians a lot of money, which they couldn't pay, and so they ended up sacking Constantinople instead.
A lot of the great treasures that were once here are in Venice. They're scattered through museums all over the world.
And so one can only imagine how rich this space must have looked when it was covered with gold and silver, when there were gems studding its most important furniture,
When people were venerating the relics that were here and the icons that were here.
when this was the center of the empire.
That was a lot of information about Hagia Sophia. Oh, there are still people here. Okay. Any questions about that one? Once again, keep in mind, don't just list facts on your compare and contrast. It's very tempting to do that, I know, but try to refrain. You're comparing these two objects. So next will be the Chartres Cathedral.
At the great medieval cathedral, Notre Dame de Chartres.
It's easy to think about this church as a day trip from Paris, but back in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, the town of Chartres was a major destination unto itself.
But it's important that we understand it within the orbit of Paris, because Gothic as a style developed in the Ile-de-France, that is the area around Paris that was ruled by the King of France. We think now of France as a nation with stable borders, but in the medieval period, the king only controlled the area immediately around Paris. And it was in this area that the architectural style of Gothic first developed.
Now, Chartres was a destination for a very particular reason. It had, and still has, the tunic that the Virgin Mary wore. It was believed when she gave birth to Christ.
And as the Virgin Mary's importance grew during the medieval period, the importance of this church, and specifically this relic, grew.
We're looking at the cathedral today with apartments and cafes around it, but this was once part of a complex of buildings that included a school, a palace for the bishop, a hospital, and in fact, the School of Chartres, an educational institution very much akin to a university, was very important and famous during the Gothic period.
Many other people associated with the School of Chartres believed that the pursuit of knowledge, learning about the world around us, was a pathway to understanding the divine.
And they were studying the texts of the ancient Greeks and Romans, of Aristotle and Plato.
In fact, we can see the impact of the School of Chartres in some of the sculpture that adorns the west doorway.
The west facade of Chartres dates to the mid-12th century, and so we see it as an early Gothic facade. And that's obvious when we compare it to a high Gothic 13th century church like Amiens, where the portal is pierced everywhere, and there's almost no sense of masonry, no sense of the stone. But here, the windows on either side of the doorway are quite small.
In fact, the first story of the towers still recalls the Romanesque. The windows are actually rounded, and very little of the wall is given over to openings. The architects were still nervous about supporting the enormous weight that was to be piled above.
And that's because the stone vaulting, the ceiling of these churches, are enormously heavy.
This is all solid limestone.
And they exert tremendous pressure downward and outward. And so you need these very strong walls and piers to support the weight of that stone vaulting.
The facade is fairly simple. From left to right, there are basically three parts: a tower on the left, the central area, and a tower on the right. And if we go from bottom to top, we also have a division of three.
At the very top, we see what's known as a king's gallery, Old Testament royal figures. Below that, a beautiful round rose window. These are very typical of Gothic architecture. This is using something called plate tracery. We have primarily a sense of the stone and then openings within that, as opposed to bar tracery, where we have just these thin bars that separate the panes of the stained glass windows.
And we'll see that especially in places like Amiens. Now, below the rose window are 3 large lancets, and those vertical windows reflect the portals below them.
The 3 portals are covered with sculpture. Anyone walking into this church would read something in the pictures. But let's talk about the parts of the Gothic portal. At the very top, we see sculptures within the archivolts, and the archway that is framed by the archivolts is known as a tympanum.
Below that, supporting each of the tympana, is a lintel. That is a kind of crossbeam of stone. And those are supported by small columns known as colonnettes that line each side of the 3 doors. And those are really door jambs. And attached to those are figures, which are known, therefore, as jamb figures.
And what's interesting is that they're angled inward. And so we're invited to enter the church,
Well, this front porch is quite shallow compared to what will happen at, say, Amiens.
where the doorways become almost funnels into the church.
And the archivolts protrude outward, creating canopies. So overall, this front is really fairly modest compared to what happens in the Gothic. Nevertheless, it is one of the most important and one of the earliest fully conceived sculptural programs. Let's get close and take a look. When I was in school, the 3 tympanum were taught to me as follows. The tympanum on the left showed the ascension of Christ. The largest of the 3, the tympanum in the middle, showed the second coming of Christ. And the tympanum on the right showed scenes that related to the life of the Virgin. Things have changed.
We have a new interpretation, and that is that the portal on the left, instead of depicting the ascension, depicts Christ before he takes on physical form.
That is a Christ out of time.
Before the incarnation, before God is made flesh. Below, we see 4 angels.
And probably my favorite part of this is the way that the angels try to reach below the barrier that separates them from the prophets. Some of the prophets don't seem to have any idea that there's anything above them, although a few have cocked their head with some interest.
Well, they're prophets. They begin to see the future. They begin to understand God's plan for mankind, but they can't see it entirely.
In order to see that, we have to go to the right tympanum, the tympanum devoted to the Virgin Mary.
Who makes possible God taking on physical form and entering the world so that we can be saved.
Let's start with the lintel. We can make out a winged figure. This is the Archangel Gabriel announcing to the Virgin Mary that she will bear Christ.
And next to this, we see a scene known as the Visitation, where Mary is visited by her cousin Elizabeth. Mary is pregnant with the Christ child, and her cousin Elizabeth is pregnant with St. John the Baptist.
Then the most important scene in the lintel, the center. And here we see Mary in the manger, having just given birth to the Christ child, who's swaddled just above her.
And just to the right, a scene of the adoration of the 3 shepherds who have come to honor the Christ child.
Above this, we see Christ in the temple.
Mary and Joseph have brought the Christ child to the temple.
And then above that, in the temple, we see the Virgin Mary enthroned with the Christ child on her lap with angels on either side. This represents the throne of wisdom.
When Christ is shown seated on Mary's lap, Mary's body is understood as the throne of wisdom. Christ is understood as the personification of wisdom.
And Mary, in turn, is understood as that throne, but also as the church itself.
Both Mary and Christ are shown frontally, very symmetrically, and Mary is enthroned here as the Queen of Heaven. On the left, we had an image of Christ before the incarnation, before taking human form. On the right, we have the moment when Christ enters the world in order to save it. And then in the center, we have the second coming of Christ, when the dead rise from their graves and all of mankind is judged.
What's important, though, is that that is the end of time. So a period before time, a period of human time, and a period at the end of time.
Christ is surrounded by symbols of the 4 evangelists,
The 4 writers of the Gospels, and is shown in the center larger than any other figure. This is called hieratic scale, emphasizing his relative importance. And he's shown seated on the throne of heaven, surrounded by a mandorla.
large, full-bodied halo. Below him, we see 12 figures. These are the 12 apostles. Now, the jam figures are especially beautiful here at Chartres. These represent Old Testament prophets and kings and queens, and by association, the kings and queens of France.
The jams of the West work are my favorite figures at Chartres. They're so long and attenuated. They're so solemn and so elegant.
You'll notice that each figure is attached to a column, and each figure resembles a column. And so there's an interdependence between the architecture and the sculpture that adorns it.
It seems natural to wonder why the figures have been so abstracted, why they're so absurdly long, or even why their feet seem to be dangling down a bit.
These are heavenly, divine figures. They're not meant to look physical and on this earth. They're meant to look transcendent. If you look at the drapery, the folds are indicated by lines.
There's a very little sense of mass. Instead, there's a real emphasis on the linear.
By the time of the High Gothic period, and in fact on other later sculpted portals here at Chartres, we'll see figures who have much more volume. Figures become more human.
Another important attribute is their sense of isolation. Each figure seems isolated from the figures beside it.
That too will change on the later sculpted portals at Chartres and at other High Gothic cathedrals.
Well, we've been talking about the portals. I think we ought to use the doors. Let's go in. We've walked into the cathedral, and we're entering into this long space, which is based on a basilica plan.
A basilica is a type of building that Christians borrowed from the ancient Romans. It's longitudinal. It has an entrance on one end. Opposite that is the apse, the holiest part of the church.
And if you were to look at the church from a bird's eye view, you would see that the church sketches the shape of a cross, because it is the long hallway, the nave, that is crossed by something called the transept.
And here at Chartres, the north and south transept also have doorways that are sculpted.
This church is a little more complicated because on either side of the nave, there are auxiliary hallways known as aisles. And this was so that pilgrims, that is religious visitors, could enter the church and move through to the apse and around the other side without disturbing a mass that might be taking place.
And those pilgrims were primarily here to see the famous relic of the tunic of the Virgin, and later another relic that was acquired by the cathedral, the head of St. Anne, the Virgin Mary's mother.
And in fact, the most famous relic of this church, the tunic of the Virgin Mary, played a very important role in the church that we're now sitting in. We were looking at the west front, and that was part of a church that dated to 1145. But in 1194, there was a terrible fire, and most of the church burned to the ground.
But miraculously, two priests saved the tunic of the Virgin Mary. When the people of Chartres saw that the tunic was safe, they interpreted this as a miracle, one with a message that the Virgin Mary wanted an even more beautiful and grander church to house her relic.
And that's the church that we're in now.
The west front of the church that survived the fire is decidedly early Gothic. The church that we're sitting in now, that was built after the fire, is clearly the beginning of the High Gothic style.
And that's probably most clear if we look at the interior elevation. Because unlike earlier Gothic churches like at Paris, where there was a 4-part elevation, here we have a 3-part elevation.
So the 3-part elevation consists of a nave arcade, these very tall, pointed arches that are very slender and graceful.
That's the lowest level.
On top of that, we see an arcade standing in front of a wall, and that area is called the triforium. Above that, we see very tall, clear-storied windows. In this case, each bay of the nave. We see 2 lancet windows topped by an oculus.
But the 3 segments of the elevation are united by the piers and the colonnettes that are attached to the piers. And you can see them soaring from the pavement below all the way up.
And so we have that interest in linearity and these lines that draw our eye upward that are so typical of Gothic architecture. As we follow those colonnettes up, we see that they divide into ribs that form the 4-part ribbed groin vaults that constitute the ceiling, the vaulting of this church.
The pointed ribbed groin vault allowed for greater height than a round arch would. And that's because a pointed ribbed groin vault pushes its thrust more down than out.
And as a result, it can rest on smaller piers and not as much buttressing is required. We should say that one of the primary goals of the Gothic architect was to open up the walls to the stained glass that helped to make the interior a space that recalled the divine, that gave one a sense of heaven here on earth. And One of the ways you could do that was with a flying buttress, essentially supporting the building from the outside.
So instead of having massive walls within the church, much of the weight is supported by flying buttresses that help support the lateral thrust of the building. And while the flying buttresses are beautiful architectural elements in their own right, they were really subservient to the idea of allowing the walls to open up, to allow for more glass, for more light to enter into the church. But this wasn't aesthetic. The idea was that light itself was an expression of the divine. And nowhere is this more evident than in Chartres, where more of the original glass survives from the medieval era.
And that glass is largely this lovely deep blue color that's especially associated with Chartres. There's also reds and golds, creating a space that makes you feel as though you're almost inside of a jewel, with light refracting in all different ways.
It is still stunning. It's still spectacular. One can only imagine the impression this glass would have made in the 12th century, when most people's clothing was earth colors, where painting was rare,
where windows in your houses were very small. And so coming into this space was a transcendent experience. And we're so fortunate to be here today when so much of the restoration work on the interior has been completed. And we can see that the walls have been cleaned. They used to be a dark brownish gray. And the conservators here have painted the stone the way that it was painted in the 12th and 13th century.
Somewhat unexpectedly, the stone was covered with a thin layer of plaster, and then painted onto that was this light ochre color with white lines painted on top of it to mimic the joinery of the stones below, but not accurately. That layer of plaster and paint obscures the true masonry.
19th and 20th century visitors to Chartres talked about how dark it was, but they were seeing it with centuries of grime. And we are fortunate today to begin to see it the way that it looked in the 13th century.
Let's walk down towards the apse and take a look at one particularly famous stained glass window.
One that dates from the early Gothic period, from before the fire.
This tall window is sometimes known as Virgin of the Beautiful Window. The blue contrast against the red is extraordinary. It looks like the window is made out of rubies and sapphires. Mary is frontal. Here again, we see Mary as the throne of wisdom.
Mary is elongated. Both of the figures are strictly frontal. We're clearly looking at a heavenly image and not an earthly image, but a projection of the divine.
At the end of the north transept is an enormous rose window on top of 5 lancets. This is a much bigger rose than what we see in the earlier west front.
This was paid for by Blanche of Castile, the mother of St. Louis, King Louis IX, who was a major patron of Gothic art.
And we can see fleur-de-lis throughout this window, a reference to the French monarchy.
In the center of the rose, we once again see the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child. Surrounding Mary, we see doves and angels, and then prophets and kings.
For example, in the 12 o'clock position, we see King David.
When we look at the 5 lancets below, we see in the center St. Anne, Mary's mother. Remember that the cathedral acquired the relic of the head of St. Anne, so it's appropriate that she's honored here in this window.
And she's holding the infant Mary.
And in the 2 lancet windows on either side, we see these interesting pairings of virtuous and villainous kings and also Old Testament priests.
For example, the lancet just to the left of Anna shows King David and the smaller figure of Saul, who's shown with a sword through his chest. We've walked out the south transept, and the porch is so different from the west front.
Here we're about 80 or so years after the sculpture on the west facade, and things are really different for Gothic architecture and Gothic sculpture.
The porch projects much more than the west front did, which is a characteristic of the High Gothic, but the jamb figures have changed so much.
Well, before we saw a real interdependence between the figure and the architecture. The figure looked like a column, and it was in front of a column. Here, the figures are still in front of columns, but they have an independence from the architecture, which is entirely new.
The most famous figure on the south porch is Saint Theodore, and you can see why.
Well, he looks almost like an ancient figure. We see that the body has movement. The jamb figures on the west portal were so elongated and static.
They were columnar.
and they had no sense of liveliness to them. Theodore seems almost as though he could walk off the porch and greet us.
His right hip juts out, and it creates this Gothic sway. Just look at the feet. His feet are firmly planted, whereas the figures on the west front seem to dangle somehow in midair.
In his right hand, he carries a spear with a banner, and we see, much more than on the west front, a sense of volume to the drapery, especially when we look to the hem of the garment, where we see real three-dimensional folds.
Now, Theodore is still attached to the column,
We can't call him freestanding.
but he does seem animated.
In his belt, we see the hilt of a sword, and his left hand rests on a shield, which is pressed against his thigh. So there's a naturalism to his movement and the way he carries himself that tells us we're now in the High Gothic period.
The cathedral at Chartres is remarkable for so many reasons, but what I love about it especially is the way that it represents the evolution of the Gothic style, from the columnar jam figures on the west work to the High Gothic representations that we see on the south porch.
I'm so glad.
I'm going to stop it there because we're just wrapping up now. Important things that I would keep in mind, or like tips or tricks or something. I don't know. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. I don't care. But things that I would include if I were doing this discussion post would be the obvious architectural differences. Of course, one of them was made during the Byzantine era versus the Gothic era. And the Hagia Sophia has things like domes and minarets, whereas the Notre Dame Cathedral has a lot of Gothic architectural motifs to it. Also think about how they structurally pulled off those different things. Another thing that you might want to think about or discuss is the fact that the Hagia Sophia had mosaics, but they didn't have sculptures. In fact, sculptures end up being lost in art history for quite a long period of time. We don't see people making sculptures again until the Romanesque era, which comes right before the Gothic era. Whereas that Notre Dame Cathedral had quite a large amount of sculptures, and they also had stained glass windows, which was a new invention at that time period. So those are just a few things that you could mention if you wanted to on your discussion posts. Of course, both of those videos are on YouTube. You just have to it was just, I always use something called Smart History videos. They're from Khan Academy. So if you Google Smart History Hagia Sophia or Smart History Notre Dame de Chartres, it'll be the first thing that pops up. Also, this is recorded. So there's that too. Are there